Well, thank you. It's so nice to see all of you here tonight. And for those of us who are on Zoom, it's good to have you here as well. I'm not a very good IT person. I'm going to just let you know that right away. But hopefully a better art history person. Now, when you talk about women artists, there are just so many women who were associated with Dublin and Mount Monadnock and the Monadnock region over time that it would be impossible in the space that we have here tonight to really talk about every single one. And I would also say there's so much more research that needs to be done about these women's lives and their work and their ties to the region. So tonight's talk, when Alan and Jenna and I first discussed me coming here, oh, sure, I know lots about that. That'll be easy. But then when I sat down to do it, I was like, oh, so much to choose from. And where do I start and who do I highlight? Oh, yeah, see, I told you I'm not a very good IT person. There we go. I could talk about Emma Beach Thayer. She was the second wife of renowned painter Abbot Thayer, who you'll hear about next week. There's not a whole lot of research out there on Emma Beach Thayer. The middle image is a portrait of her sister Violet, and it's said that this was begun by Emma and finished by her husband Abbot. Abbott was known to have people work on his paintings and to work on other people's paintings, so that's not unheard of. And then the image to the very right is called Rabbit in Dry Grass. It dates from about 1904. And this was done for Abbot Thayer's book, Protective Coloration in Nature, where he discussed his theories around camouflage and its applications in military and other applications. And it's known that his son Gerald worked on a lot of those illustrations, but it turns out so did Emma. So I think there's more work to be done there to figure out her role in all of that. The extant work that's out there of hers is really meticulous studies of things like plants, flowers, insects, and animals. I could have also focused on Margarita Pompelli Smythe, I'm not sure. She was the daughter of geologist Raphael Pompelli. The Pompelli Trail is named for him on Monadnock. She was known as Daisy. The portrait in the middle is of one of her best friends, Rose Standish Nichols. It was painted in 1890 when Daisy was just 17 years old. She was primarily known as a portrait painter and not a painter of landscapes. The photograph on the left is of Daisy. She's the tall woman on the left-hand side, taken in the 1940s in New York with her very good friend and fellow artist, Juliet Thompson. I could have talked about Martha Silsby, who had an incredibly long association with Dublin. She grew up in Boston. She was independently wealthy. And so that made it easier for her to pursue art. She didn't have the constraints of family life and child rearing, which often can hold women artists back from really pursuing their goals. She spent decades summering in Dublin, and finally I think it was 1906, she bought a house there and became a year-round resident. She was primarily a pastelist and a watercolorist. And these are actually two pastel examples. The spinner on the left is owned by the Dublin Historical Society. The Monadnock on the right, I neglected to say who owns that, but a beautiful image of Monadnock. She was probably first brought to Dublin by her cousin, Corinna, who happened to be the wife of artist Joseph Lyndon Smith, who had the house Loon Point, which was a famous gathering space for artists and intellectuals, performers in the late 19th and early 20th century. I could have talked about Elizabeth Brooks Fuller. She's one of my favorites. Full disclosure here, I wrote my senior capstone thesis on Elizabeth Brooks Fuller. Elizabeth was from Deerfield, and she came from a family that had 17 artists over 4 generations. In fact, her grandfather was one of the most lauded Victorian painters of his day. She began studying with Abbot Thayer, and this is a recurring theme, which is artists who are students of the male artists that are around Dublin and around Monadnock. She started studying with Thayer when she was just 14 years old. Unlike many of his students who would come in the summer times, Elizabeth actually spent part of each winter with the Thayers. And you can see that from these 2 images of Monadnock, both dating from the 19-teens. Between 1910 and the early 1920s, she was there every winter. In a letter from Thayer to Elizabeth's mother, he said, quote, "If only she were a man, she would have a great career." But that really speaks volumes to the situation that women artists found themselves in during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which is really, it was a man's world. And it was difficult for a woman to create a sustained and successful art career. But instead of delving too deeply into these ladies, I decided to focus on 2 others who both defied social norms to create remarkable careers. And we're going to start with one of the artists that's represented in this exhibit, Lilla Cabot Perry. Now, Lilla, and it's hard to not talk about them by their first names, because when you read about them and you get to know their life stories, you feel like you know them. Lilla had a very privileged upbringing in Boston. Her parents were affluent, they were well educated, they were ardent abolitionists, and they were also good friends with Louisa May Alcott, Ralph Waldo Emerson. Lilla recalls playing little schoolyard games with Ralph Waldo Emerson when she was a child. She, like many girls of her day in her social class, studied literature, poetry, music, and drawing. And in 1867, at the age of 19, the family makes their journey to Europe, as all families of their class would do in those days. And there she decides that she wants to study painting. After they returned, of course, Lilla is expected to marry. She's expected to start a household of her own. And she marries a young man named Thomas Sargent Perry. His great uncle was Commodore Perry, who opened up Japan to the West. They had 3 daughters. In 1884, when their 3rd child, their last child, Alice, was just an infant, Perry finally began formal studies of painting. First privately with several different artists in the Boston area, and then in 1886, she begins attending the Cowles School of Art. In 1887, a year after her father passed away and left her a very sizable fortune, the family is able to travel to Europe and they take up residence in Paris. Over the next couple of years, she studies both in Paris and in Munich and begins exhibiting in the Paris salons. So she's in her 30s now, and she has small children at home, but she's going for it. She's studying with these artists, she's beginning to exhibit, and she's really pursuing that career. In 1889, they're still living in Paris, she sees Monet's work, and she's really lit on fire by Monet's approach to Impressionism. And so the family spends the summer of 1890 in Giverny, and they develop a friendship with Monet. Over the next 20 years, Lilla would spend 9 summers in Giverny. Monet, oftentimes it'll be said that he was her teacher, and that is not entirely correct, because Monet actually did not take in students, but he was a generous friend and mentor to this young woman artist. In 1891, so a year after spending their first summer in Giverny, they returned to Boston, and Perry really devotes herself to fostering what she calls a new truth in painting based on Impressionism. Now you have to realize in 1891 in Paris, Impressionism is out there, people know about it, they're exhibiting, people are seeing it in the salons, and they're even moving past Impressionism. But in Boston, which is very conservative in terms of its artistic tastes, Impressionism is this like wild new idea. And she becomes one of the leading proponents for Impressionism and for this approach to art. Impressionism, really what it's about is painting as you see it. Painting as you see the way the light reflects off of surfaces, the atmospheric effects that light makes in the sky against the clouds. It's very much a en plein air kind of approach where you're capturing things just as they look in nature. And this is very different than the more traditional work up a sketch and then take it back to the studio and spend like 6 months working it out and modeling it all so that it's completely round and really fools you into thinking that it's real life. Impressionism isn't about real life. Impressionism is about the impression of light and color on the canvas made with paint. The painting on the left is actually of her 3 daughters, and then there's a French landscape on the right. And you can really see that her time with Monet in France has created this really beautiful sort of scintillating kind of surface treatment. The colors are just saturated and gorgeous. And she brings this back to the United States. And in the 1890s, she begins exhibiting in Boston and New York and in Paris. She's developing an international reputation. In 1897, she had her first solo exhibition. And very few women in these days got solo exhibitions. And one critic said, quote, "Mrs. Perry is one of the most genuine, no-nonsense natural painters. Such paintings must be taken seriously." Interestingly, that same year, 1897, her husband received a teaching position, an appointment to teach at a university in Japan. And so the family moves to Japan. And they're there until 1901. And she takes that impressionistic sensibility to this new landscape, this new place. And here's 2 really beautiful examples. There are many, many paintings from their time in Japan. On the left, Mount Fuji, and on the right is called A Japanese Garden. These both date between 1898 and 1901. In 1901, they return to Boston. That decade, 1901 to about 1910, 1911, proves to be a very difficult one for the family. Both she and her husband are suffering with some health problems, and they're also facing financial difficulties. And because of those financial difficulties, Perry turns her attention really to portrait painting, because portrait painting, you get commissions and you make money with it. Whereas landscape painting is a little more speculative. You paint landscapes and you put them in galleries and you hope somebody will buy them. These 2 are just 2 really nice examples. The one on the right, the green hat, is just stunning. And it really shows not only can she paint in that sort of high-toned, almost ice creamy kind of colors, but also with really deep, dark tones and high contrast. And then in the teens, the family has a summer retreat in Hancock, and they start spending time there. And they call it flagstones. And this is a painting from flagstones looking towards the mountain. This is absolutely one of my favorites. This is called A Snowy Monday, and it's from 1926. Eventually, that sort of summer country retreat becomes more of a year-round retreat, and she does a great number of works that are in the wintertime. And as is so often the case, these reproductions, as nice as they look on the screen, they don't do justice to the subtlety that is found in the actual work. So the snow is not white. It's all these different, very subtle pastel-y colors. And you've seen that on the snow in the wintertime. And she just captures it so perfectly. This one, there is a very similar one here in the exhibition. This one's called Early Morning Winter and dates from 1928. And you'll notice the way that the sky is rendered, that dawn glow, and then the very subtle shadings on the mountain. This is somebody who's absolutely at the top of their skills. And then this beautiful one, Spring, from 1924. I love artists' self-portraits because I think it's so interesting to see how they present themselves. And this one just really speaks to how self-assured she is. This is from about 1890, so this is really done right when her career is really on its high ascent. She started her formal training at 36. Within a decade, she has an international reputation, and you can see that in the way she gazes back out at the viewer standing at her canvas. This is somebody who's in full possession of what they're doing and are meant to be doing it. Her legacy, not only did she leave a remarkable body of work that's held in major institutions across the United States, but also the promotion of Impressionism within the United States and particularly in Boston. Much of the Impressionistic collection at the Boston MFA was due to her efforts and her promotion of this new way of looking at painting. One of her good friends was the art critic Bernard Berenson, and he had a very outsized influence on collecting in the United States, particularly in Boston. He's the person who advised Isabella Stewart Gardner on what she should buy, and he also served on the acquisitions committee at the Boston MFA. So an amazing, amazing career. And 30 years ago, she would not have been somebody that people would have recognized her name. Her career was had been eclipsed by time. And it's through the efforts of scholars and family members and museums like the National Museum, I always get the name wrong, National Museum of Women in the Arts, to promote through exhibitions and publications, and now the World Wide Web, to really solidify these reputations and have them part of the American artistic canon. Now, the next person I'm going to focus on is also unbelievable trailblazer, and you've probably never heard of her. And I will be honest, I had not heard of her either until I started preparing for this talk. And originally I thought she might just be one of my quick ones at the beginning. And then when I got into her story, I was like, there is no way I can't share this because it's amazing what this woman did. I have to say that I'm totally indebted to the work that has been done by her great-great-granddaughter. She has been researching her great-great-grandmother's life, writing articles, getting things out into the world so that people know about her. And her name is Susan Hinckley Bradley. The resurrection of Bradley's reputation is so well deserved. She was born in Boston, enjoyed an education very much like Lilla Cabot Perry. I just also love this picture. She looks like a hot ticket. And, so many of these folks follow the same sort of path. In 1871, the family makes a trip to Europe. And it's at that point that the exposure to the museums, to the art in Europe, just ignites a passion in her for art. And in 1875, she's able to return to study. And she studies in Rome. This image right here is, I think it's called Arundel Castle. It's a castle. She studies for a couple of years and then returns. And in 1878, she's back in Boston and she starts studying at the Museum School of the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. And she starts exhibiting with the American Watercolor Society. And Susan Bradley is primarily a watercolorist. So before I go any further, I just want to say, in many ways, she was fighting two battles. One, she's a woman artist, and two, she's a watercolorist. And even to this day, there is kind of this hierarchy in the fine arts where oil painting's at the top, and then sculpture, and then the other things like watercolor or pastel or printmaking. Those are all seen as sort of lesser than. And they very much were in the late 19th century when she's trying to put together a career. She comes back and then she marries an Episcopal rector. He was the assistant rector at Trinity Church in Boston, the church that she had attended for her whole life. And his name was Leverett Bradley, and they had 4 children. His career, over the course of his career, would take them to Maine, back into Massachusetts, and then finally to Philadelphia. He was a very progressive husband for his time, very supportive of her ambitions. Whereas I don't know all the ins and outs of Lilla Cabot Perry's personal life. I wouldn't pretend to, but Lilla Cabot Perry had money of her own. So she had the ability to kind of call the shots on what she was going to do. But Leverett was very much supportive of his wife pursuing a career. And so rather than putting her ambitions aside while she was raising their children, they were both pursuing their careers in parallel as the children were growing up. And it is said that they were a match. They shared all the same interests. They loved art, they loved music, ideas. They were very much an intellectual couple, and they just were a great duo. So she's pursuing her art, but Boston at this time is really limited, even more limited than other cities like New York or Philadelphia. The Boston Watercolor Society and the I've always mispronounced this, forgive me, Bolthoff Club were male only. So as a watercolorist, she did not have a place where she could exhibit in her home city. So what is an ambitious young artist, watercolorist to do? She and Martha Silsby, who I mentioned earlier, and 15 other women artists in Boston, watercolorists, in 1887, founded the Boston Watercolor Club. It was women only. And it was active for the next, and they kept it women only for about the first decade, and then they did finally decide to let men in. Ultimately, the Watercolor Club the Watercolor Society, it all ends up getting merged together and is still in existence today. It's known as the New England Watercolor Society. But at the time, it was very much silos, and that was very confusing for the Boston press, evidently. On the left, you see this is their very first exhibition from 1887. That's the cover of the exhibition catalog. And unfortunately, in those days, exhibition catalogs just named the artist and the title of the work. It doesn't have images, which, you know, so dearly we'd love to see what those pictures look like. On the right, another one from 1890, which is just shows you how many works she has in there. And there's one of Mount Monadnock. She remains active with the Watercolor Club for the next 30 years, and she is one of their top sellers. Around this same time, she starts spending time in Dublin, ultimately staying 4 summers to study with Abbot Thayer. And she is also close friends with Martha Silsby's cousin, Corinna, Joseph Lyndon Smith's wife. So there, all these social and family connections is really what brings people into this orbit around Mount Monadnock. In 1891, an exhibition review of the Watercolor Club said, Miss Bradley exhibits 2 pictures of Mount Monadnock, which since Dublin became a fashionable resort, has been constantly sitting for his portrait to all sorts of painters. I think there's some interesting word choices in there. Because first of all, they call her Miss Bradley, and she is Mrs. Bradley. And second, it gives a gender to Monadnock, that Monadnock is male. Do with that what you will, but I do think it's interesting. This is one of Bradley's Monadnocks. I think it's absolutely stunning. I mean, there's something so beautiful about watercolor because you get these wonderful, pure, saturated colors. But based on the exhibition catalogs, Bradley made many portraits, paintings of Monadnock. But where are they? When you look for her in the collections catalogs of major institutions, there's a few here and there. Harvard has some, Boston MFA has one, a few others, but she's not heavily represented. If you look for Lilla Cabot Perry, you're going to find her in all the major collections in the United States. And some of those might have been collected during her lifetime and some later, but she's represented there, whereas Bradley is not. Some of that's probably down to the fact that watercolor is not seen as a high an art as oil, but also I think because after her lifetime, her career really became eclipsed. It was sort of forgotten with time. The other thing is, we know that she was a top seller in these exhibitions. So they're out there, and they're probably still in private hands. Many of the images I'm showing you are actually images her great-great-granddaughter has shared, and they're still held by the family. So unfortunately, although I know there's tons of them, I only have one of her Monadnocks to show you tonight. But thank goodness it's such a beautiful one to drink up. In 1893, she is invited among many successful American artists to exhibit at the World's Columbian Exhibition in Chicago. The World's Columbian Exhibition was this gigantic World's Fair, and it really was about showcasing the greatness of American industry, American arts, American letters, and showing that to the world. It was also a huge moneymaker for the city of Chicago. It was about bringing in tons and tons of people. Bradley was invited to exhibit in the Palace of Fine Arts with the men. Most of the women who exhibited at the World's Columbian Exhibition were in the women's building. They were segregated into a separate exhibition space, but she's in with the men. Lilla Cabot Perry was also there with the men. I don't know if you can see it. It's probably a little small from where you are, but the central painting on that wall, that's the men's exhibition. But the central painting there is a woman with her hands raised above her head. That's a John Singer Sargent. So that's the level that she's being exhibited with. Now, throughout the 1890s, she's actively exhibiting in Boston and New York. She is pursuing many different subjects, not just landscape, but still life, interiors. There's all sorts of things. There's also in her work many, many pictures from her various travels. I selected these two because I just think they're so great, these two Egyptian images. The one on the left is actually a charcoal drawing, and that is in the Fogg Museum at Harvard. And the one on the right is in a private collection. That's the temple at Luxor. That temple at Luxor is as good as anything John Singer Sargent ever painted in watercolor. It is masterful. Now, by 1897, Leverett's job as a rector had taken him to Philadelphia. So the family moves there, and Susan becomes quickly involved with the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. But she's a little bit disillusioned with the scene there because watercolor is definitely kind of relegated to a secondary status. They have an annual exhibition and the watercolors are kind of hung off in the corner. You know, they're never forefronted. And she feels like, you know, much like Boston when they founded the Watercolor Club, that there needs to be more opportunities for women artists within the whole Philadelphia, Pennsylvania scene. So she, along with a number of other Philadelphia women artists, found what's called the Plastic Club. And what they mean by plastic, this is well before plastics like we think of plastic. It's about things that are not complete, that they're still malleable, like the unfinished artwork. And so that's what they're referencing when they called it the Plastic Club. And the whole purpose of the Plastic Club was to provide exhibitions, classes, studio space, meeting space, exchange of ideas among women artists. This is a revolutionary idea at this time. It's extraordinary that she was involved in this. And I'm so happy to tell you that the Plastic Club is still going strong in 2024. I mean, that's an incredible legacy. In 1900, she founded the Pennsylvania Watercolor Club, this time not just for women, but the idea was really to promote the appreciation and recognition of watercolor as a fine art. You know, many women in the late 19th century who received this kind of, you know, affluent young ladies' education would have been taught some watercolor. And it was really seen as sort of a nice thing that you could do. And really relegated to, you know, for women, for amateurs. And she really wanted to combat that and put it on par with the other arts, with the other mediums in visual art. Her efforts, eventually, they lead to recognition from the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts with the establishment of an annual exhibition for watercolor. This is a beautiful still life of a water lily. This interior, it's called Miss Estie's Salon. This is actually in the collection of the Art Institute of Chicago. And like I said before, she is in some collections, like Harvard or the MFA in Boston, but she's just not as well represented as other artists of her day that were oil painters. Throughout the remainder of her life, she continued to promote both women artists and watercolor for to elevate them. She was a true trailblazer. And the work that her great-great-granddaughter is doing, it's so deserving that this reputation be sort of resurrected and solidified as she was one of the leading American artists of her day. And I'm so happy to be able to share all that with you. And then hopefully more of them will come to light and somebody will do a nice catalog of all of her works, and we can really learn the true scope of her contribution. So I feel like I blazed through that, and I was worried on the way here I would run too long. So thank you so much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer questions. And I think we'll have a wireless microphone going around so that everyone can hear your questions.
All right, thank you so much. All right, I saw at the moment we don't have any questions on Zoom. So if anyone on Zoom has a question they want to ask, feel free to type it in. In the meantime, do we have any questions from the audience in person right now? All right. Well, if people need to think about one, what I have to say is, what do you think drew so many artists to this region?
Okay. Yeah, I've given this a lot of thought over the years. I think, it's a combination of things. One, as I mentioned in the talk, once you start getting a few people, then their connections, either familial or through school or through work, they start drawing other people in, and then you start getting this kind of critical mass of like-minded people. And I think if somebody could do some kind of like crazy computer thing where they could trace out all the connections between all the different artists around Monadnock, I think you would find this like incredibly tight web. I think the other reason why it became such a place, as that critic in Boston said, Monadnock has become a fashionable resort, and now he's sitting for his portrait all the time. I think that Monadnock and the Monadnock region, they're accessible. They're not that far from Boston or from New York. Whereas the White Mountains is that's a whole nother level of journey to get up to the White Mountains. And there certainly were, many artists and others attracted to the White Mountains as well. But this was accessible. And then Monadnock itself, when you think about it, in many ways, it's a very accessible mountain. I mean, it's not 10,000 feet tall. So it is something that people of varying abilities can enjoy. But at the same time, Monadnock is totally wild. It has so many different ecosystems as you go up. It's kind of the best of both worlds. You've seen the photographs of the women in the wool skirts and the high heel boots hiking up Monadnock. They were able to do that, but then they're getting this really wild, untamed experience on the mountains. So it's that interesting combination of wild adventure, yet you still had your picnic lunch and got on the train at the end of the day. So I think all of those things come together. And then once you've kind of got that artistic alchemy going, it just perpetuates itself. And so many of these artists and other intellectuals, so many of them were related to Harvard. Once they start buying property, and then their children are there, and then those children inherit those properties, it perpetuates down over the generations. I mean, there are many descendants of these folks still living in the area. Lola Cabot Perry has descendants here, the James family, just to name a few. So that's why I think that it has been so popular and remains so. Oh, come on.
Thank you so much. What a great presentation. I made me wonder whether any of these women were involved in the suffrage movement.
Yeah, I think it would be very, very interesting to trace that out as well. I can't tell you off the top of my head, and I'm smart enough not to speculate without checking first, checking my facts, but I suspect many of them were. I also think that, for the person who has the time and the inclination and the research skills, is somebody really needs to do sort of a systematic study, looking at all of the male artists and figuring out who all their students were, because I think we're going to find a lot more women in there than we might have initially thought were there. And that would also reveal relationships to other things like the suffrage movement and so on. Anybody else?
I noticed with that painting that Susan Bradley, yeah, that of Monadnock, that there was like a very cleared section in, and I wondered, have you ever thought about what perspective she used, where she was?
I'm not exactly sure what that perspective is, but the interesting thing about that image with that cleared area is that there are two paintings that, to my knowledge, are still in a private collection. One by William Merritt Chase, and the other, I think it's Abbott Thayer. Yeah, Abbott Thayer, that are views of from that very same vantage point. And there was logging that happened on the mountain during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which was one of the things that prompted a lot of the land conservation that happened during that time, was because of the logging projects. So I'll be totally honest with you. I might have it in my notes, but that's from graduate school, and that was a shockingly long time ago now. But I was very lucky. When I was in graduate school, I got to see those two paintings. I had a professor who knew the people who owned it, and he arranged for me to go see them. So when I saw that, I was like, oh my God, it's the same view. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. And it could very well be, although Thayer, and I don't want to ruin next week's discussion, but because Elizabeth studied with Thayer, I happen to read a lot about Thayer. Thayer was known to trample all over the mountain, so he's got views from everywhere. But I actually think that this view is from their house, or near their house, where the Thayers lived. Yeah.
When I saw that, I thought immediately about Pompeii and whether you're looking across that to the mountain. Because you can see the mountain behind.
Right. Yeah, and that very well could be.
Any other questions from the people in attendance in person right now? Another question I had was, do you think there's any artists that painted any people artists that painted the mountain that were lost to history or lost to time?
Oh, I'm sure there are. But I'm also going to say that they're never really lost. If the work still exists, there's a chance that somebody will come along and recognize it and resurrect their story. Yeah. That's the fun part of all of this.
So it looks like we don't have any questions.
No. Okay.
Speaking of Elizabeth, I was curious about what drew you to Elizabeth Brooks Fuller for your senior capstone or senior thesis, when there are so many wonderful women artists.
Well, so okay, so the professor that I had, who was he's an Americanist, was a very, very demanding professor, and the seminar, the capstone seminar, was American women artists, And so he had selected, I forget how many of us were in there, maybe 8 or 9 of us. He had selected 8 or 9 women artists that very little had been written about or was known about, because he wanted us to do original research. And he wrote their names on a piece of paper and he shuffled them up like cards and he handed them out. And I got Elizabeth Fuller. And so I went up to the museum in Deerfield, who had recently received a very large, so almost 800-piece collection from the Fuller family. And the curator, here I am, really excited and earnest and, oh, so exciting. And I'm in a museum storage and I've never been here before and it was cool. And she pulls a painting off the shelf and she goes, well, Elizabeth did spend some time, and I was like, on Monadnock? Because I recognized it immediately. And she was surprised I knew Monadnock. And then I explained, well, I live right near there. And so it was kind of like fate brought us together. And at the time, and this professor didn't tell me this until right before graduation, Elizabeth Fuller, out of the 9 that he had chosen, was the one the least had been written about. So at that point, the only thing that had been published about her was her obituary. So I spent like 3 months reading family letters and tracing out her history and looking at her paintings and doing a chronology. And it was great, it was a great training for me, and really fed my love for research. I love finding the stories. And so that's how it happened. Anyway, I'll finish that. I just wanted to let you know that professor is now the executive director of a major New England historical institution. And whenever I even drive by there, I'm like, ooh.
One more question. Do you think there's something distinctive about women painters that would enable you to look at a painting and tell whether or not, to some degree of certainty, that it was painted by a woman?
No, I don't. Because women painters have been so left out of the kind of typical discussion of American art, or European art for that matter, for centuries. And it's only been since the 1970s that historians and art historians, scholars, museum curators have been kind of resurrecting the stories behind some of these incredibly beautiful, powerful, skillful works that have been lost to time. Oftentimes, women did not have the same opportunities to build that career that would ensure a lasting reputation. Like Bradley being shut out of exhibitions in Boston just because she's a woman. So I think that's why. But as far as like, is there a womanly way of painting and a masculine way of painting? I don't think so. Others might argue differently, but I don't think that there's one particular way that women paint.
And maybe just to round out the Q&A, a question, a theme of the exhibit is what makes the Monadnock a good muse? And a question I like to ask people is, what do you think it makes Mount Monadnock a good artistic muse?
Well, I think it goes back to what I was saying before, that on the one hand, it's accessible. On the other hand, it's incredibly wild, and you see so many different things there. And we were discussing this before the program, because Monadnock is that mountain that stands by itself, and you have so many viewpoints on the mountain. Monadnock has 1,000 faces. You can see it in so many different ways. And I think for a landscape painter, that's got to be incredibly exciting to be able to paint the same subject, but have a completely different view on it, different atmospheric effects, different seasons. You just never see it the same way. Each time it's different. So I think that's why Monadnock is a muse.
All right, I think that's a good amount of questions to have been asked and answered. So again,
Okay.
I'd like to thank Michelle for coming and
Thank you for having me.